Andrew Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it's a great pleasure to take a call following the member of North Shore and the amazing amount of information she provided to the House, and that, once again, a very short speech from the member for North Shore. But we still haven't heard the answer, Mr. Speaker, despite it being asked in the committee stages and speakers in this third debate, that we do not have the answer as to why the 10% figure was chosen, while Australia is 8% for the covered bonds market, and the likes of Canada is 4%, and other jurisdictions around the world range between that figure of 4 and 8%. And we still haven't had the answer. We've had members of the Finance Committee, including Paul Goldsmith, the current chair, and other members of the Finance Committee, including Maggie Barry and others, and yet not one of them has answered the question. And it is somewhat surprising, Mr. Speaker, that in the House of Representatives, where quite clearly it's a pretty black and white situation, why has New Zealand adopted a 10% ceiling? The officials are sitting over there. I'm sure they know the answer. I'm sure they would love to give us the answer. And it's probably a very sound and solid answer. It's probably a justifiable answer. But we still haven't been given the answer. And now we've got the Honourable Jerry Brownlee in the House. Perhaps the Honourable Jerry Brownlee has come along with the answer. Maybe he's been researching it all morning, working out why is it 10%. And they've probably been sitting up there on about the 6th floor of the Beehive, ringing, oh, you're on the 7th, Jerry. And he's been ringing through to Bill English's office saying, Bill, why is it 10%? And Bill says, I don't know, Jerry, I wouldn't have a clue why it's 10%, it's 10%. And Jerry said, well, I'm going down to the House shortly and I should know why it's 10% because I hate going to the House and not being able to answer the questions. And being the leader of the House, Jerry Brownlee, I would have thought he will have done his homework. He will have been up there on the 7th floor, he will have heard this debate, he will have been riveted to the television all morning, and he will have said, I'm going to go down there and I'm going to explain all. I'm going to tell New Zealand, I'm going to tell the large viewing public out there in New Zealand why the government has selected 10% while Australia is 8%. I'm going to explain why in so many other legal areas and financial areas where we try to harmonise with our big cousin over the Tasman, why we have selected 10% rather than 8%. Why are we giving preference to international investors to get 10%, their clause on 10% of the funds of funds of any financial institutions in New Zealand, should they, heaven forbid, go belly up, rather than in Australia only getting 8% clause into them, or in Canada only 4%. And I think it would be a great shame if this bill does pass, and it's going to pass because it has unanimous support of the parties in this House, but it would be a great shame if the very learned Jerry Brownlee wasn't able to answer that simple question, and this goes into the annals of history as being a mysterious figure that was plucked from the air, put into a bill, into an Act of Parliament, but was never answered and was never actually determined as to how the figure was. But like so much legislation put through this government, it probably was done, with a dartboard or a flicker thing. They probably tossed a coin and said, "Oh, shall we make it 6? Shall we make it 8? Shall we make it 10? Oh, let's toss a coin." As so much of the legislation that's brought before this House by this government often doesn't have the facts behind it. They told us that the sale of the shares in the mixed ownership model, that would end up with all these New Zealanders owning the power companies and Air New Zealand, and how many? 2.5% of New Zealanders now own those shares. Where before 100% of all New Zealanders, everyone in this room, every New Zealander out there had 100% ownership of those power companies. Now half of those power companies, or 49% of them, are owned by a miserable 2.5% of the elite people who can afford to go out and buy the shares in those power companies. And the same's happened with Air New Zealand. The same's happened with Air New Zealand, Mr. Bennett's. The same's happened with Air New Zealand this week. You know, again, we all have pride in our national airline. We get on the national airline and say, it's ours, it's great. You know, we owned over 3/4 of it. It's our airline. Now you get on and say, oh, well, we own 53%. The other 47% could be owned by anyone. Could be owned by anyone. A bit like the power companies now. The Mellon Bank of New York. The Mellon Bank of New York bought 8% of Meridian. Now, isn't that shocking that suddenly they're in New York, probably an old mate of John Key's who was a banker in New York, I'd say, probably got a phone call and said, hey, there's a good deal coming up here in New Zealand. Oh, thanks very much, John. Oh, yeah, we'll be into 8% of that. That'll be great. Thanks for the tip. Thanks, mate. Next time you're in New York, I'll buy you a bottle of Bolly. And I'm sure that's probably how the conversation went. And this is what happens. This is all these deals with the national government. It's happening all the time because people are benefiting for the favoured few, the ones who get tapped on the shoulder by the national government. The ones who get tapped on the shoulder by the national government, they benefit, while the rest of good, old, average Kiwi New Zealand suffers. Good old Kiwi New Zealand suffers. And as a fifth-generation New Zealander, can I just say on both sides, on my father's side and my mother's side, I am getting heartily sick and tired of seeing our country being sold down the river. And quite frankly, you know, my parents, my grandparents, their parents, going right back to the 1840s in New Zealand, did not spend all their time helping to develop this country over many generations for this one generation with Jerry Brownlee, Stephen Joyce, John Key, Bill English and their ilk, this one generation selling off all the hard work of my parents, my grandparents and their parents and parents before them. It's disgraceful, and it will always go down as this was the generation that sold the wealth of New Zealand down the river for the benefit of the 2 or 3% who could afford to be participants in it. So, Mr. Speaker, in closing of this speech, New Zealand First will support the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Covered Bonds Amendment Bill because New Zealand First supports any legislation that has merit to it in terms of improving our financial systems. And we have been strong opponents of loose financial arrangements which saw 61 institutions in this country go belly up in recent years, which saw the likes of Canterbury Finance taking more deposits in the 6 to 12 months without the Minister of Finance or Treasury or anyone keeping an eye that they were taking more and more deposits and couldn't cover them. And that situation cannot be allowed to continue. So this piece of legislation is a small part of the overall framework to try and improve the financial securities in this country to ensure that we do not operate a cowboy Wild West financial system, and as a result that there is more security for those investors, including international investors, coming to New Zealand, and that we are not seen as a third world financial place. So New Zealand First will be supporting the bill.
David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to take a short